Yo, what is up, my friends? Welcome to another episode of Dostcast. My name is Vinamre and If you are new to our YouTube channel, please subscribe because we release new episodes every Tuesday and Friday at 12 p.m. Indian Standard Time. If you're listening to this podcast on an audio platform, make sure to give us 5 stars because we're the best in Bharat. Today's guest is Rukmini S, an independent journalist based in Chennai. In 2004, she began covering Mumbai city for the Times of India. Since 2010, she has specialized in data journalism. In fact, today's conversation is about her new book, which is called Whole Numbers and Half Truths: What Data Can and Cannot Tell You About Modern India. I'm going to read out some stats from the Amazon description to give you a glimpse of what is going to be in the conversation. For example, only 31% of 100 Indians live in a city today and just 5% live outside the city of their birth. As recently as 2016, only 4% of the young married respondents in a survey said their spouse belonged to a different caste group. Over 45% of voters said in pre-2014 election survey that it was important to them that a candidate of their own caste wins elections in their constituency. A large share of reported sexual assaults across India are actually consensual relationships criminalized by parents. And staggeringly, spending more than 8,500 rupees a month puts you in the top 5% of urban India. This and many more crazy stats and data from India from data journalist Rukmini S on today's podcast, which begins in 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I've been digging through your work and I find data to be boring unless it's with graphs and cool visuals. But in your particular case with your book and your articles, I have been absolutely astounded at some of the things I've discovered. We're going to get into a bunch of that. But first of all, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. And when you say that you find data boring, it immediately tells me a couple of things. One is that a lot of us working on data, and not just journalists, we've just not been doing a good enough job to communicate it. Because when people say this, either that they find it boring or that they find it scary and intimidating, which a lot of students and younger people say. It just sort of it's not feedback it's feedback that I enjoy getting, because it sort of lays out what the course of looks like or what it should be and what the work that we should be doing is. So well, I'm here to change that.
Awesome. I already have recorded an introduction for you, but if you could in brief kind of give your background about what is it that you do specifically that propelled you to write this book, what got you into data journalism, all of that, if you would quickly have a brief of that.
Sure. So my name is Rukmini S. I'm a journalist based out of Chennai, India. I've been a journalist for about 15 years now, and I started off as a field reporter in the Times of India's newsroom in Mumbai. I studied for a bit, and then I moved to Delhi at the Times of India, and then at the Hindu. I've been a data journalist for the last 10 years now, and starting off at the Hindu, where then I went on to become data editor. And one of the things that really sort of propelled me into this shift was the feeling that there just wasn't enough rigor to the journalistic conversations we were having. And it wasn't just frustrating to write in that way. I could sense from readers that they were frustrated to read these sort of he said articles. So that was the idea, to try and bring more rigor in any form into journalism. And because I had done a master's in which I had come across research and statistics around India for the first time, because I'm not trained in economics, politics, maths, stats, anything of any use. I too was encountering all of this for the first time. And so now that my eyes had been opened, I wanted to try and incorporate this into my journalism. And that's how I moved to data journalism. A couple of years ago, someone suggested to me that because I had been writing articles about a range of socioeconomic issues around India, pulling them together for one book that tried to answer key questions around India would be, a good way to go about it. So that's what I did. I wrote the book, which tries to answer 10 big questions about how things work in modern India through a combination of what good data can tell us, and I stress on good here because not all data is good, as well as what my field reporting and my conversations with experts have shown me that the data misses or gets wrong. And I'm currently working on my second book.
Awesome. I have this thing written down in front of me, which just says Indian workers work the longest and earn the least. And the only people who are exceptions to this are probably people from Gambia, Mongolia, Maldives, and Qatar, right? And then in your article, you further stated that India probably has the lowest wages in South Asia. and we're sitting here having this conversation on a Wednesday morning. I mean, for me, the weather here is just awful. Um, and I am self employed, and I was reading the stats, and it said self employed people also work a lot as well. Um, for me, this data was astounding because there's a common trope in films and cinema associated with Indian laziness or lying around under a tree, often doing nothing, and there's enough people idling around. So when I saw this, I was like, is this just Bangalore or is this skewed to the rest of the country? Like, what is happening?
So my answer to that is really that it's not just Bangalore, but it is bubbles, and all of us, better off Indians operate in these bubbles that give us a pretty skewed idea of how we think India functions. And one of the ideas really behind writing the book was this, that I wanted to encourage Indians, particularly elite Indians like you and me, to look beyond our bubbles, because that sometimes gives us a completely wrong picture, sometimes an overly positive picture of how we think the country works or the country functions. And yes, to me that too is a extremely telling indicator. The fact that the majority of Indians do not get a day off from work. So the idea of 2-day weekends or 3-day weekends is such a minority conversation in that respect. So what we think of when we think around idleness is often the notion of being either in jobs that do not match your skills or do not challenge you, or being underemployed. So I would say that a lot of Indians probably are underemployed and report in surveys too that they would like to do more work or different work, or work of a different sort or with greater security for better wages, all of that. But notionally, unemployment is very low in India. Hardly anyone is actually unemployed, because pretty much no one can afford to be unemployed. So everybody is doing something or the other, which is why statistics that might work in the US, for example, where unemployment is such a closely watched indicator, are relatively meaningless in India, where unemployment, I would say, on its own is virtually unusable as an indicator. Perhaps unemployment for the graduate white collar segment says something, but not, and it does say something for the country as a whole, but it's really a sort of indicator that captures very little. So understanding what work it is that Indians really do is again something that we're very far from knowing, and something that in casual conversation we often assume things that really aren't the way the country works. So for example, we would imagine that most people are in wage work of some sort, either they're casual laborers or salaried workers. And the sheer size and scale of self-employment in India is something that takes people by surprise. Again, this isn't self-employment of the sort that you and I are in. It is your one-person retail, thela wala, samosa walas, peanut sellers, all of that. So, one of the sort of statistics in the book that or not a statistic, a sort of way of classifying numbers in the book that always amuses me is that India has something called the National Classification of Occupations. And this has a code 121, which is directors and chief executives. And according to official statistics, it is the third most common, classification, occupation for urban workers. So that makes it seem like urban India is awash in CEOs and directors of their own little Bangalore-style startups. But further investigation has shown that these are actually, for women, for example, most of them are either self-employed or unpaid family workers. These are women assisting their husbands, samosa stands and vegetable carts. So, again, this is a case of sort of crime by definition, where technically you might be right, but you're missing the wood for the trees by using definitions that don't necessarily work for India. So just to underline the fact that whether it is on the world of work, whether it is on how much money we make, whether it is on inter-caste relationships, all of these, and these three in particular, have to me been sort of revelations in terms of how tight the bubbles we live in are, and so what a surprise reality then can be.
So, what is the problem with definitions in reporting data and definitions in reporting statistics? I mean, you mentioned a bunch of things at the start of the book for sure. when it comes to crimes. We'll get to that in a second. But specifically, are our data gathering bodies, are the metrics they use, are they unreliable? Um, does India have a lack of self-reported data or accurate data? Third, are data points fabricated to meet political goals? How do we, because you wrote this book, so you arrived at these truths. But when you look at common parlance, if someone who's enlightened enough to go and actually look at data, if they ever do that, I'm assuming it's going to be hard to parse through everything and arrive at, say, like a staggering truth, like Indians work the most, right, comparatively to the rest of the world, something like that.
Yeah. So let me sort of lay out to you what the landscape of data looks like, so which makes it easier to understand what we get wrong and why we get it wrong. Because when all of it looks like a black box from the outside, then you assume sometimes malfeasance when it's not necessarily there. So what we actually have in India is an official statistical system that's truly impressive. And I say that despite working regularly with PDFs and sort of data that's classified in difficult ways and that's hard to use. And a lot of why we do have this impressive statistical architecture has to do with the history of it. So the history of Indian statistical systems is very closely entwined with the moment of independence, and the same sort of imperatives that drove the setting up of planning and all of those processes in the early 50s underpinned statistics as well. So Nehru imagined statistics as an important tool of planning. This was a poor country, and the goal was to improve people's living standards. But how poor it was and who needed what was impossible to plan for if we didn't have accurate statistics around it. And so Nehru and Mahalanobis were really, that was the sort of thinking behind how what we aimed for, what we shot for right at the beginning, which is why the statistical architecture that we put in place in the 50s was audacious. It was far beyond what a country at that level of income and development had any right to be thinking of. It was a moonshot. It was, our ISRO in a way. And it made us the envy of not just the developing world, but the developed world as well. We had the first nationally representative household survey, which is a sample of households, not the whole country, not a census, a sample of households, and trained surveyors coming to your house asking you a list of questions, which then gives you detailed information about that sample, which, because your statistical systems are so good, is something you can generalize for the country, and then you can plan around how people live and eat and what they need. We had the first large nationally representative household survey anywhere in the world, not just in the decolonizing world at the time. So that architecture has held us in very good stead for very long, and it explains a lot of why we still have data that conforms with international standards and that has underpinned planning all of this while. But we can't rest on our laurels, and what's happened in the last couple of decades, and I do want to sort of emphasize that sometimes we think of historical change as beginning from the moment we discovered it rather than from the moment it actually happened. So I do want to say that these are processes that have, this sort of decay has gone on for 10 years or more and has been sort of well detailed by the data journalist Pramit Bhattacharya, for example. So we didn't invest enough in upgrading our statistical systems. We didn't make them, we haven't digitized enough, they haven't been nimble enough. We actually don't have enough full-time trained enumerators as well. We have a part-time enumerator sort of cadre, while we should have had much more staff even to do this job.
I'm sorry, what's an enumerator?
It's a person who enumeration is counting. So an enumerator is a person who's counting you. In the census, they're the people who go to every household and fill out the forms. In a sample survey, they come to a sample of households. So basically, the person doing the survey form filling is the enumerator. And we've moved over time from having full-time trained enumerators to part-time enumerators. And some economists say that that's actually affected the outcomes of what we're able to count. So the sociologist Sonalde Desai, for example, says that it's likely that part of the reason we do not fully capture female employment is because we have now moved to part-time enumerators who may not know how to ask the questions well. So these things can have very real impacts, not staffing our statistical system properly. So that's where we stand. Impressive architecture needs upgrading, needs to be more nimble, but still standing in line with international systems. It's not a question of reliability that's the problem. The problem is one, difficulty in making data publicly available and easy to understand. That's certainly there. And I would say that the sort of onus on that runs at multiple levels and not just at the government alone. Yes, you would want the government to make data in sort of easy machine readable formats, but you would also want academics and journalists to do a better job of communicating that information, and that needs training, that needs sort of background knowledge of how these numbers even work to be able to communicate them. Now, on the accessibility side, we've actually made huge leaps in the last 3 years or so. We have more than one government-run excellent data portal that makes data for people like me or other journalists who work with it better available than ever before. What we still need to do a better job of is communicating it and helping other people to access that data, not sort of becoming gatekeepers of that information. The questions around definition and the issues there typically tend to be about not updating concepts in line with changes in the world. So, for example, the census measures occupation, the jobs that people do historically in three ways. There used to be agriculture, then there would be home-based work, which would be people who do artisanal work at home, and then there was others, and you can imagine how large that other segment is. It essentially captures pretty much most of non-agricultural work, and we had no breakdown of that. It was this huge others. So at least in 2011, those occupational categories should have been updated so that we had greater information on that. So sometimes it's a question of just not being nimble enough or moving fast enough. I think we also did a bad job of, we also took way too long to make employment information more high frequency, which means available more often. You need to know how the economy is moving in near real time. You can't wait for annual reports that come out 2 years after the fact for that. So we do now have a quarterly report, which is an improvement on the past, but perhaps we need to get even faster, and perhaps that change needed to happen even earlier. And then there is an issue which is relatively small as a part of the story, but is important, which is about data that is not shared. And that has happened a couple of key times in the recent past, and it's important to call it out when it does happen, as journalists have. So we had an official employment survey that was held back, and it showed unflattering things, and then 6 months down the line it was put out, and it did show exactly what journalists had said it was going to show. So there was no problem with the data, but it was held back because it was inconvenient. Then we've had a survey on consumption, which in India we use as a proxy to measure how rich or poor the country is, which was held back and then taken off. So it was pulled off entirely, and there's now a fresh one that was conducted. And we also have the criminally delayed census. We should not have a 14-15 year we should not have a 4-5 year delay in our census, which we now do. So that question of important data not being available in the recent few years is an issue and is worth calling out.
So what's the incentive for not showing data? And secondly, are there other countries in the world who have better infrastructure around gathering data? For example, perhaps the US or any developed country whose models India can mimic and arrive at a place where you can competently tell in this small pocket of let's say middle India, central India, you will find that 3% of people are XYZ, something like that. Um, so two things then. Number one, is there a political incentive to hide data from the public, especially around elections? And second, are there countries whose data infrastructures we can borrow to make it better for ourselves?
So yes, I mean, I would say anywhere in the world there are incentives to hide inconvenient data, and the solution is not to hope for angelic behavior from governments, but the solution is to put in place, legal safeguards. So what we have, I mean, one of the sort of, I would say, failed legacies of this good infrastructure that we put in place in the 50s was to not have an independent, autonomous, separate body. So
What about think tanks then?
no, so what I mean is checks and balances within the government system. So the UK, for example, has something that the Office on National Statistics that is legally independent and autonomous from government. There's multiple ways to put safeguards in place. Similarly, the US, for example, has the Congressional Budget Office, which again is separate in many ways, and sort of insulated from government pressure, not in ways where you expect good behavior from people, but where you make it impossible to cross those lines. So we have a National Statistical Commission in India that is meant to be an independent oversight body, but it was never given the legal teeth that it needed to be truly independent. And by continuing to not make the sort of independence and autonomy legally enforceable, we're really missing a trick over there. And I think, I think it's important for more people to know about it, and for some sort of sort of public consensus to grow around it, so that we're not left with just complaining about not having independent statistics. We figure out how we can do it, and then we work on doing that. Um, I mean, sure, there are think tanks, but the legitimacy is conferred by the sort of court of public opinion, and which means positions can be sort of dismissed at will, right? Nobody is obliged to take on board the position of any think tank. You can say either they're not good enough, or you can say that they have their own interests. So I think that this key role is one that is played by governments around the world. So even in the UK, for example, the question of excess mortality, which is something that excess mortality from COVID, which is something that we've grappled with in India as well. The question is simple. It is that in a pandemic, every country will miss some deaths. We're not going to be able to capture some deaths. So we don't know which of those are from COVID and not. We call it excess mortality, which is the difference between deaths in a normal year versus deaths in a pandemic year. And then you say this is attributable to the pandemic, whether or not it was directly a COVID death. It could be even from, like in the UK, there were deaths in care homes, for example, that may or may not have had to do with COVID. But the reason that the UK continues to have these excess mortality figures is not because of any sort of work by think tanks, journalists, anyone on the outside. The UK's own Office on National Statistics produces these numbers. So we can think about external checks and balances, but I am much more invested in strengthening democratic systems as they exist. And so in thinking about what are the checks and balances and what are the systems we need to develop to make our own statistical system, strong. Sorry,
when it comes to COVID, that's fine. That was a beautiful tangent. When it comes to COVID deaths, right? India was shocked by the second wave in a way that probably no other country did. We're seeing something in China now because they had a zero contact policy and they're just getting out. I still feel like in the second wave, because I was present around people who lost their family members, lost a lot of people, there was a kind of outcry amongst the public in which they said that, hey, we think that deaths are being underreported and that certain figures were deliberately kept from the media to essentially undermine the widespread damage and deaths that happened during COVID. In that particular time, does data go for a toss? Like, what what is the role of data there, like, and who is collecting it? And I'm sure you mentioned it a bunch of times online as well, and in the book. What was specifically interesting about these COVID deaths that you found from a data journalistic angle?
So, in some ways, the story of what happened with COVID deaths in India is really sort of emblematic of, you know, of what happens with numbers in India, because there are sometimes systematic and legacy issues, and then there is direct suppression, and then there is and the sort of figuring out what's what is essential. So the thing with COVID, and as we have, when you bring up China, and I already brought up the UK, which has seen now, 2022 had the highest excess deaths in the UK in 50 years. So I don't think any country with a decent, any democratically elected country, any country that calls itself a democracy, should or can claim that they were unaffected by COVID, or that they captured all deaths and that there was no excess mortality. In fact, if we accept even the WHO's figures, which I'll come to in a minute, it does show large excess deaths in India. It does show that by the end of the second wave, while the official count was 500,000 or 5 lakh, the WHO's estimate is 5 million. So that's a 10x underestimate. But even if you accept those numbers, which the government doesn't, it would place India, proportionate to population, as 35th in the country, in the world, in terms of COVID deaths. Not the worst, not the best, somewhere sort of middling. And that is partly my point, which is that every country in the world missed COVID deaths for reasons that make sense. In India's case, too, make sense. It's just that if we want to claim that we did better than any other country in the world, we have a problem. If we say that, yes, we missed some deaths, and in some places we missed a lot of deaths, and here are the reasons, and let's try and fix it. To me, that's to be expected from a middle income country in a pandemic, and in a case where we were hit by a particularly bad variant, the Delta variant, which had to do with the second wave. I don't like to behave as if the second wave was entirely sort of man-made. Let's be very clear about the effect of the Delta variant, particularly on a largely unvaccinated population at the time. So, so there's a couple of things that happen. One is that India misses counting deaths from disease historically. We just do not yet have a perfectly developed, perfectly matured system that counts all deaths. So here's an example. When that 10x number made your eyes widen. In 2017, India officially reported 192 deaths from malaria, while again modeled estimates from the Global Burden of Disease put that number at 50,000 deaths. That's a 40x underestimate of a disease that we've known about for hundreds of years. Similar huge underestimates of tuberculosis, of gastroenteritis, diarrheal deaths. We miss counting deaths from disease, and we need to get better at that. We should have gone into the pandemic with an acceptance of this, and some of these again are reasons that make sense. Some of these diseases, like malaria, for example, shares symptoms with multiple other diseases that happen around the same time. So this sort of monsoon fevers that particularly the rural countryside experience, symptoms are extremely common unless you're able to get access to testing, which, as we know, again through the pandemic, is very patchy across the country. So this shouldn't be news, because people working on health have known this sort of thing for a long time. They've been working on it. So we go into the pandemic unable to capture all deaths. Additionally, from deaths that do happen, our official system is not able to register all deaths, because not everybody, reports it to the authorities. This is particularly a problem when it comes to people from marginalized communities, women, and in rural areas. We miss more deaths in rural areas than in urban areas. Some states are particularly bad at it than others. In the most recent years, we feel the estimate is that India now registers over 90% of all deaths. However, Bihar registers 50% of all deaths. It still misses registering half of all deaths. So it just doesn't have the administrative capacity to do that yet. So we go into the pandemic already with all of this background. And then when something like, then additionally, our official definition of what should have been counted as a COVID death was supposed to come from the WHO, which included both suspected as well as confirmed deaths. However, every state government that I spoke to told me that they did not register a single suspected death unless there was a positive test prior to death. Nobody was registering them as COVID deaths. This changed slightly after the Supreme Court stepped in. That was only last year, so much after all of this had happened. All of this is going to add up to an undercount. I mean, it's right on paper, you can see you're going to miss a lot of deaths, and you can, a back of the envelope calculation would put the extent of underestimating at something like this. And then you had the second wave, which in its sheer scale overwhelmed health systems, testing facilities, administrative capacities, crematoria. All of that was overwhelmed. So you are certainly going to miss deaths in that respect. So I think there are perfectly sort of rational or easy to understand explanations for why we would miss the number of deaths that we did. This doesn't place us better or worse than most of the world. But if we want to claim that we did a better job than everybody else, then we have a problem there.
Wow. I had no idea that both for malaria and COVID, we've underreported massively. I want to move to a slightly different topic. And this is right at the start of your book, where you said that in most FIRs, especially when it comes to sexual assault or rape, if the woman or the man for that matter is also murdered, then the murder is shown as the principal offense, and that rape, sexual assault, or other sexual crime is not reported at all, right? When I read that, one, it was a bone-chilling experience. Second, and you explained that in the first two chapters, where a lot of what we know as sexual crime, very little of it is convicted. I mean, could you just particularly give light to that chapter in the book? Because I think that is probably one of the most stunning realizations I've had when it comes to even Delhi's reputation as the rape capital, even our reliance on FIRs, all of those things.
Yeah, it's a whole bunch of eye-opening stuff for me as well. And I sort of stumbled on each discovery, in many cases purely by chance. Because what happened was that in 2012, when the Delhi assault took place, I lived in Delhi at the time, and I was a journalist who used to be out late at night myself. I'm not from Delhi, so I wasn't, I had all of those apprehensions as well. And it wasn't just my job to look up numbers and sort of bring context to the conversation that we were all having around crimes against women.
Oh, just one more thing, a small interruption, because I remember the stat from the book. You said in the book that women are more likely to choose a horrible college if it means being safe, right? If the route to their college is dangerous, but the college is prestigious, they'll reject that. Just wanted to say that, yeah.
Yeah, I'll bring that in as well. So yeah, I mean, part of it was also led by me trying to figure out my own notions of safety, and me trying to understand what the numbers showed, and what, whether I should be modifying my own behavior as well. So, there was this long overdue conversation that really sort of burst forth, like the dams broke open in 2012, because you could just sense the pent up years of sort of frustration that women had experienced, both because of experiencing sexual crime and its minimizing in the public discourse that was sort of, pouring forth. And that was an essential conversation, and I'm, glad that it happened and glad to have been part of it. But when it comes to numbers, and even when it comes to sort of general conversation around it, a lot of it, or almost all of it, was derived from police statistics, because we didn't have any other numbers to look at. So things like headlines like Delhi being the rape capital of India, for example, come from police statistics. And having been a field reporter in Mumbai, where many times I'd be on the day shift or the night shift, where your job was essentially to hang around police stations or hospitals or fire stations and just sort of figure out what's going on for the day, you really get to see the workings of these systems up close in a way that that statistics or numbers never tell you. And from being at police stations late into the night, I knew uh, that using the FIR, the first information report, as a sort of perfect building block for police statistics, and then forming all of our assumptions about the entire country and crimes against women on it, was a dangerous enterprise. And the reason I knew this is because using the FIR as proxy for fact is a problem, because of the sort of push and pull of forces that go on before an FIR is registered, and because of the highly compromised environment in which India's police force functions. So what I wanted to do was go beyond police statistics, and one way of going slightly beyond it was to look at court cases, where there's just so much more information available. Sometimes I was able to attend the court cases. I was definitely able to talk to judges, prosecutors, lawyers for the accused, families on both sides, and read court documents, and so get much more information than what a single number in police statistics is able to tell you. And what I ended up finding was that by looking at 1 year, over 600 cases tried in Delhi 7 district courts, by looking at one calendar year, I found that the largest share of those cases, over one third, nearly 40% in all, had to do with consenting relationships, often intercaste and interreligious, in which the parents were opposed to the relationship. So what they were doing was that they were filing kidnapping and sexual assault charges against the man, and in an effort to force the woman to return home.
This is 43% of the cases you found?
Yeah, of the fully tried cases, the vast majority. I mean, the largest individual section. So that made me sort of think hard about it. I ended up finding similarly in Mumbai and in Madhya Pradesh, the two other places I looked at. Other people have done academic work that finds similarly, and more worryingly for me, in fact, other work has found similarly in the use of POCSO, which is the law against sexual violence against children, because if you're under the age of 18, POCSO applies to you, and organizations including Vidhi Legal Center in Bangalore and HUC based in Mumbai have similarly found that a large share of sexual violence cases registered under POCSO are actually romantic relationships that are either criminalized because they are statutory rape, meaning it is sexual assault in the eyes of the law since they are under the age of 18, or
but they're both minors, or one person is an adult? Because that gets tricky, right?
So it all gets very tricky because age verification is a complicated process that takes a while to figure out, and at the FIR stage, age verification is not done. So if the complainant family says that the accused is a major, then the FIR will say that, even if it's found differently otherwise. So when families are trying to break couples apart, what the FIR will say is that the woman is a minor and the man is over 18, even if facts show otherwise going further, just because it makes police action and separating the couple that much easier to do. So none of this is to say that sexual violence doesn't take place or is a myth, or that everybody lives extremely safe lives in India. In fact, one of the other findings that doesn't come from court cases, but that comes from looking at a large internationally accepted household survey, is that the vast majority of sexual violence that women in India experience is actually within the marriage, which is not is not a crime in the eyes of the law, since we haven't criminalized marital rape yet in India. So that's one part of the story. The other is the point that you mentioned about what goes in the FIR. So one of the reasons I started looking at these numbers was I was trying to understand how the 2012 case fit in India's statistics, sort of trying to understand the statistics through this case. And so when I was talking to the person, in charge of the numbers, I said, okay, so what would happen is that when you prepare these statistics for 2012, this case would go under sexual violence Delhi. And he said, no, actually it wouldn't. It would go in as a murder. And I didn't understand how that happened. And what he explained to me was this, which is India follows something called the principal offense rule while recording crime in its official statistics, which is, suppose somebody tried to break into your car to steal your phone, and you caught them and or you passed by them and they pushed you on their way out. The FIR would say maybe there would be something under the Motor Vehicles Act because there was a carjacking. There would be simple theft, and there might be simple assault as well because someone bumped you and you may have fallen down while they were rushing off. Now the FIR has all of these sections. However, the police statistics only take what is called, quote unquote, the most heinous offense, which is the one that carries the highest possible sentence. So it won't have theft and simple assault and Motor Vehicles Act. It will only have that one section that could carry the maximum offense, makes it to the police statistics. The idea ostensibly is not to overcount, because if you counted those three separately, then it would seem like the total number of crimes in India is larger than it actually is. But the end result is that we undercount. We officially undercount every single crime in India except murder, which again is not particularly esoteric. Other countries do this too. However, until I pointed this out in 2013, it was never mentioned anywhere. It wasn't mentioned as a sort of, asterisk or caveat or italics or anything anywhere. And when we wrote about it in the Hindu at the time, we got some very angry letters from the, official in charge. But in subsequent years, they now include it in their limitations and methodologies. So that's a question of following a particular metric that has a very important and far-ranging effect on police statistics, but nobody even knowing about it because it was never sort of made clear. And finally, just to your last point about the routes that these women were taking, which is work that came out through an academic paper. Part of my concern about the way sexual violence is reported by using these police statistics as proxy is that in some ways I fear it uh, it magnifies the specter of stranger sexual violence. It makes the roads and public places seem far more unsafe than they actually are. I wouldn't say than they actually are, seem far more unsafe than what the numbers should actually suggest. And let me explain why that is. Because if we're finding this large number of crimes against women as reported in police statistics, if we then go on to find that a big share of them are to do with relationships, consenting relationships, then that, and additionally, if we find that other sources of data show us that the largest experience of crime is actually within the marriage, what we're doing is we're ending up magnifying and blowing up crimes that are experienced in intimate spaces and making it seem as if these are actually in public spaces. And I fear that one of the sort of, side effects of the conversation that happened in 2012 and onwards is that we have actually ended up creating an atmosphere where reducing the freedoms and agency of women seems like an important and essential thing to do. We made it seem as if the streets and public spaces were so unsafe for women that doing things like what the women in the study were doing, which is taking colleges that were poorly ranked to avoid bus routes that were perceived as being unsafe, is something that we've ended up, seeing probably as a result of the way we talk about sexual crime. So in no way am I trying to say that women in India are uniquely safe and that we do not need to talk about sexual crime anymore. However, I do feel the locus of what we are focusing on is wrong, took a wrong direction after 2012. And we are going to actually make it worse by some of the things we do. The more we put, the more we sort of criminalize consensual love by doing things like making inter-caste and inter-religious relationships appear to be criminal, and put these intense pressures on couples attempting inter-religious relationships. The more we do that, we're just opening the doors for a greater sort of role for the police in aiding families and separating young couples.
Yeah, it's so weird how when families want to separate couples, the route that the police often takes is exactly the same as the families, right? Where even if you're a major, your individual agency as a citizen of this country goes to toss, and vaguely define family values and honor and reputation is the bedrock which families and police operates on. It's so weird how they always become cahoots in a scheme against something that consenting Indians want to practice on their own.
Absolutely. And it goes to the fact that the police are drawn from the same society that we're talking of. So, when I would talk to police officials about this, that I would ask them, how is it that you were willing to take down an FIR in which this person says, so and so ran off, when you know from making a quick call to your sources in the area that they have been in a relationship for a long time, or that they're already married and have children in some cases as well. They would say, but what can you do when a father comes to you and says that, my daughter's honor is being taken by someone? So they share the same biases because they are drawn from the same society, essentially, which is not to excuse it. In fact, it is to refocus the fact that we cannot allow the rule of law to be sort of played with by police officials, by making it seem as if this sort of lawless enforcement of misogynist norms is acceptable. The thing is, we do not see any action for doing it. There is no penalty for behaving like this. In all of the cases that I saw and that I reported on, when I spoke to the judges, they were tired of hearing about cases like this. They were, truly bored of having cases like this come before them, because it took up a huge share of their time as district magistrates, for example. But unfortunately, and here, this is what you talk when you say patriarchal society. You're not talking about one person, you're talking about it across the board. So the judges too there would be annoyed perhaps with as much as the parents, but there was no sanction against the police proposed by any judges. So if we're going to allow this to happen with no action, there's no incentive to stop.
Right. And recently wrote an article, I think recently, about the religious differences in India and how Indians think about religiosity, which is probably in sync with what we've just been discussing. When you said that Indians will respect all religions but would like to live with their co-religionists, which I found very interesting, which is something that I've not seen through data. I mean, I don't know how to mine data, but I've observed it in the city of Faridabad, which is next to New Delhi, which is where I live, which is sort of like it used to be like a suburb. Now it's developed into a full industrial city. And it's more tight knit than Delhi, and caste identities and family lineages matter here more than, say, other parts of North India, or equivalent. I mean, I'm just saying it's not the capital. So here I've seen that. I mean, you mentioned in your article in Mint that, for example, Hindus will want to congregate with the Sikhs and Jains, who are a minority subgroup, but will almost have nothing in common with Muslims, and vice versa. And in all Indians, almost none of the groups like intermarriage at all.
Yeah, it's one of those things that the data has shown us for a long time now. And I think we've all been unwilling or unable to accept it and to make it an important part of the public conversation, so that people like you or others who don't necessarily look at the numbers should not have been surprised by it. We should have been saying this for a long time, and which is why this sort of conversation around a fringe that happened in the last couple of years was extremely frustrating, because we've seen now for a long time in the numbers that these are not fringe beliefs. They are very much mainstream beliefs. The mainstream of this country is opposed to interreligious and intercaste marriage. The mainstream of this country is opposed to intermixing between religions in almost any way, from being neighbors or friends to, you know, and absolutely as a no to getting married. And as you point out, it's important again to note that this isn't a Hindu trait. This is shared across religions. This is not a country where people of any religious group are sort of pro intermixing between religions. So, we have had decent opinion polling around this for decades now. And the fact that this still isn't something that sort of seeps into public conversation, this is an area where I have a grouse against liberals over here, because I feel like there has long been a desire to embrace a fantasy of a broadly tolerant country with an intolerant fringe, and we've known for a long time from the numbers that that's not true. We shouldn't have had to rely on numbers alone. We should have been able to, look out of our windows and see that that wasn't reality either. Um, uh, and I think many liberals have wanted for so long to embrace that fantasy that they have not allowed reality to correct it. Uh, the numbers have for a long time shown that this is not a country that's broadly tolerant with an intolerant fringe, that these are mainstream beliefs. The fact that surveys have shown, and again, these are well-known, well-established surveys, not something that I had to go looking for, that surveys have shown, for example, that in a study of 5 states, a majority of people not just said that they were opposed to interreligious marriage for themselves or their children, they believed it should be outlawed. They believe we should bring in laws to ban interreligious marriage. We've known this for a while. These are some of these are, I've tried not to look at data that's more than 10 years old for the book, so that I'm largely seeing things about today. So they would be maybe, I think this was a 2015 survey, but there's no excuse for this, for us not having made this an important part of the public conversation, except for some sort of fond and romantic notion of what we would, the Amar Akbar Anthony country that we would.
Or in history books, they often have this idea of a unity in diversity, that kind of thing, where you actually believe that, or even on paper, people want to be secular. But if the data is saying that, I mean, I completely get your, your problem with liberals there, because on one idea you believe that the fringe is doing it. On the same, the data also says that it's actually Muslims who are most opposed to intermarriage, right?
Yes.
Which is
Yes.
something you would not expect at all.
Yes, and I do feel like there should be a distinction between ideals and reality. So I too do not want to make the argument that religious tolerance is not an ideal that I want to aspire to. It is an ideal I want to aspire to. It is what I want the country to be. It is how I want my neighbors to be. It is how I want to live my life. I want my family's life to be. However, I am able to see that that is not Indian reality right now, hasn't been for a while. And I think if people do want to shift that reality, I do. For example, I want this to be a country where people think well of each other and do not feel that if someone's of another religion, then they are, persona non grata, let alone being violent towards them. Then there's work to do. It's not going to happen automatically. If we thought that along the lines of most of the Western world, that becoming richer, more educated, and more urban was going to automatically lead to more progressive values, we have seen for a long time that that's not happening. And if we do want that to happen, we're going to have to do some sort of different work. It's not going to happen automatically.
Yeah, you will. You will be. I mean, I'm sure because you lived in Mumbai as well. Despite Mumbai being one of probably the only true metropolis in the country, the only metropolitan country, even there, you've got specific requirements about your gender, your caste, your marital status in order to qualify for getting an apartment, right? And this is the same wherever you go. It's the same with marriage testimonials that you see in newspapers. It's the same with getting apartments. The brand of we tolerate everyone just works well when you write it down, but in lived reality, you could have, like in Gurgaon, the biggest, the best companies coming in Cyber Hub, but right next to it, there's going to be an apartment that's up for sale or like for renting for 20,000 rupees. Oh, but you can't get it because you eat meat. So it's just very weird stuff like that that absolutely makes no sense.
Yeah, and a couple of things over there. One is that I think, a lot of people, richer urban Indians feel that they see a lot more inter-caste, inter-religious relationships around them, or they feel that on matrimonial or dating apps, the filters around caste, they feel that they don't see them, and so it's not there. But first of all, there is a difference between uh, what you say and what you do. So if more people are saying that they are open to intercaste relationships, but the share of Indians in an intercaste marriage does not change over time, then there is a difference between what people say and what they do. And then secondly is the point that the experience of caste and religion is not uniform. So I do feel like we need to be quite sort of clear about it isn't that everybody faces these barriers. The unique barrier that a scheduled caste man on in matrimonials faces, for example, which is something that we see from the data that and we see this from the US, for example, in terms of uh, the distinct bias in on dating apps again that African American women faced in the US, which is again documented in studies. So people face biases of different sorts, but let's be sort of quite clear about where the sharp end of it is and who really experiences it. And even when it comes to things like meat eating, I think we should be sort of very clear about where that antipathy comes from and who it affects, particularly in the most sort of violent manifestations of it.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Now, you recently quoted something from NHFS. I believe I'm butchering the actual name, which published a survey about the median age of having sexual intercourse for the first time across the world. And I mean, I hate the whole "I'm an engineer, so I can't get laid" trope that Indian men and like younger Indian men use a lot. But there is clearly data that says that let me just read this out. It says the sex life of Indian men are having it at age 25. Sorry, 1 in 3 Indian men in their late 20s had not yet had sex. In contrast, just 1 in 10 women in their late 20s had not had yet sex. Had not. I can't for the life of me read this out. Had not yet had sex. Yes, it's just a lot of had not yet hads. Anyway.
So it has nothing to do with being an engineer. I'm really sorry to all the engineers out there who can't get laid, but it has nothing to do with being an engineer. It has to do with the way it has to do with the way marriage is constructed in India, and it has to do with social norms around sexual relationships and around that. So the reason that so many more women in their later 20s have had sex rather than men is because women get married earlier. The tight sort of interlinking between sex and first experience of sex and marriage in India is really what underpins all of these statistics. So the reason that the age of first experience at sex is getting later for both for men is because men are getting married later.
Right.
If engineers in the country are concerned about this statistic, then what the work that needs to be done is not about getting more women to get on Tinder. What needs to happen is a delinking between the tight control around sexual activity and marriage, which is
correct
what it is in India right now. And so what you would expect to see again from our bubbles is we all have the impression that people are now having sex earlier than they ever did, right? You would think as generations move on, people have sex earlier and earlier. That would be how you would imagine things happen around the world. In India, we're seeing the opposite happen. We're seeing the first experience of sex happening later and later because marriage is happening later. We are seeing more people spend more time in higher education. And then, in fact, bizarrely, we are also seeing a push for the age of marriage to be further raised. It's already quite high at 21 for men and 18 for women, but we're seeing some conversation around pushing that further. So what we're seeing in India is sort of in some ways an opposite of what we're seeing in the rest of the world, which is that the age at the first experience of sex is actually rising, and we are now at a point where young Indian men are, at least in the subset of countries that were studied, have sex among the latest in the world. And what that means for the country, for social dynamics, for all of that is really something that I don't feel we talk about or study or understand enough.
Yeah, I think half the problem lies in just the fact that, um, say, beyond the advent of OYO rooms and places like that, there is a real risk of just being flagged to death for attempting to. I'm not talking about elite Indians where, maybe you say your parents have a 2 BHK or a 3 BHK and they're out and then you can experiment. And it's even harder for girls, right? Because there's literal reputations and honors at stake of not just you, but your entire family. That is typically the way these things work. So Indians may experiment, but the act of sex is just so dangerous before the advent of OYO rooms that people would never even try, and they would have to wait till marriage to make that happen. And it's so funny. I'm 26 right now. Just turned 26 a few days ago, and I remember as a kid at 16 and 17 talking with all my friends about the idea of sex. Now, we grew up on American movies and seeing like British cinema and American cinema, where teenage dramas were the norm, where you would see people at like high school proms and then they lose their virginity, that kind of stuff. So you start seeing as Indians, oh, maybe we should also be doing the same kind of thing, but you realize the attitudes are completely different, right? Like we didn't have proms or anything like that. People would be lucky to get in a room with someone of the opposite sex, right? Because it's also, I mean, this is something I read. This is not data. This is just what I read in a Khushwant Singh book that he wrote in the 80s about how in rural India, typically men all sleep on cots that are adjoining each other, and women do the same. So really, even the idea of exploring yourself, your sexuality as a young Indian is very limited because there's so much taboo, and because we live in tight places with several people and it's a collective society, so it's just harder to do that.
Absolutely. I mean, we still very much are in a place where typically people go from their parents' house to their marital home. And again, when you see that in the statistics in terms of the, the share of Indians who live in a shared flat or a PG or something, it's minute. You again think that in urban India, it's a huge number, but it's in the lower single digits. It's an extremely small number.
So you're saying somewhere around 1 to 9%? That's it?
Like 1 to 3%, in fact. Yeah. So that again is not, it's extremely uncommon. And it's part of sort of tight control on all aspects of young people's agency, but sexual agency in particular being the area of tightest control. And then when that collides with these sharp restrictions on intergroup mixing, so inter-caste and inter-religious mixing, then yeah, when it's physically dangerous for people to then do this. In fact, I mean, the idea that young people in this country are making these leaps of faith and entering into intercaste and interreligious marriage is just, it's astounding, because it is an act of extreme bravery, given the world that they live in. I can't think of anything more, anything braver that young people in India do than attempting relationships with people out of their own caste and their own religion.
Yeah, I'm still stuck on the 1 to 3% statistic because initially at the start of the conversation, you talked about how we live in bubbles as Indians, right? And all the data points to the other direction. I thought almost all my friends live in 1, 2 BHKs of their own studio apartments, live in shared accommodations with their friends, probably because I'm in my late 20s, so I've just been seeing people moving out. But that still makes 1 to 3% of all of India.
Yeah, I'm going to look up that number and get it to you, because I remember being quite amazed by it as well. I'm going to look up that number and get back to you.
No problem. Yeah, also another stat, and we can probably start closing things off from here, is, in common pop culture.
I got it. I'm just going
awesome.
Okay. Okay. 65% of 15 to 34-year-olds live with their parents, and another 31% live with their spouses. So that's 96% of those between the age of 15 and 34 live either with their parents or their spouses. The common perception of millennials' lives may be those who share an apartment or live as paying guests, but just 4% live either with a friend, in a hostel, or alone.
What?
15 to 34.
When you do comparative stats, that just makes it sound even more horrible. It's like the entire country is either preparing for marriage or is married.
Yeah, pretty
There
much.
is literally no midway point. So I should totally just move to Goa and like find those 4% who live in their own shacks. That's crazy.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, this always is a sort of reminder that of how tight your bubble is. If you are someone, and I would say when I was in my 20s, most of my friends too lived by themselves. So it's a reminder of how we are all that 4%.
That's crazy. That, I mean, you know what? It's one thing to have widely held notions about your age group, and it's another thing completely to have that dismantled by data. And I
Yeah.
think one of the merits of doing what you do is you can live your life and see your environment and assume that to be the case for the rest of the country. I mean, there are socioeconomic differences and geographical differences, and you eventually start believing, I'm pretty sure that me as a urban person in Delhi is roughly in the same situation as someone in Bangalore. Not too many differences. Like the Venn diagram is basically overlapping. But then when you hear stuff like this, it's such an objective view of reality. It just completely shifts what you see. Like basically, if I move and live by my own, I am rebelling against the mainstream statistic because no one else does that in the country.
Yeah, if you want to feel really lonely, I've got another few.
Please.
Another few ones to sort of blow your mind. So again, we sort of assume, again, most of us live away from where we live, from where we were born, right? And again, we assume that's Indian reality, but it's actually super rare to live away from home. So here I'm going to make you feel a bit lonely again.
I think I read in the blurb something like 96%.
Yeah. Just 5% of the country lives outside of the state they were born in. 5% of the country.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's 95% of the people live either in their birthplace or in a vicinity to their birthplace or in the same state. And if your state is Haryana, you basically live, 500 kilometers from, damn.
Yeah. Then you know how, and again, this is much more a southern thing, but people assume in the south that that migrants from the rest of the country are flooding in. Just 6% of people currently living in Karnataka were born outside the state. So you'd think Bangalore is just full of people. Just 6% of people currently living in all of Karnataka were born outside the state.
Maybe Bangalore is a skew then, huh?
Yeah, no, we hardly migrate. The point, this notion of the country as awash with migrants, so both Kerala and Tamil Nadu, states that have pretty significant anti-outsider sentiment because of the feeling that they are again, awash with migrants, were in 2011, the last time we had data, they were net out migrants. There are more people exiting Kerala and Tamil Nadu than there are migrants entering. So all of this sort of anti-outsider sentiment in the two states, I don't know, it's not really. And then let me sort of really
please
bring in where how much of outliers we are. If you make more than 8,500 rupees a month, in 2017-18, if you made more than,
or do you spend more than 8,500 rupees a month?
You're right. Yeah. Sorry. You've got me on that. If you spent more than 8,500 rupees a month in 2017-18, you are in the top 5% of urban India, not even India as a whole, urban India.
That just completely shifts people's minds, because if you go on Instagram, you've got these millionaire motivation reels going on all the time.
Yeah.
How to make $500,000 a year, how to have like 1 crore rupees in revenue.
Yeah.
I don't think people assess that the bar is quite low. All you gotta do is just make 9,000 rupees and spend 8,500 rupees, live on 500 rupees somehow, and you're basically in the top 5%. That is ridiculous.
it tells you how poor the rest of the country is. That's what it does. And it tells you, you know, just how different our lives are from what is basically Indian reality.
I saw a video of these. There's a popular trend online where, like, one guy will go to like a person on the street and say, "I've got 20 rupees. Do you want to take it, or do you want to double it and pass it to the next person?" Right? Kind of like a charity train,
Yeah.
do good, all of that. So he goes to this guy who's walking the dog. He's someone's house servant,
Okay.
and at this point the money is roughly around 1,000 or so, which is quite a lot because it's been doubled that many times. So he says, do you want to double it or do you want to keep it? So he says, I make 8,000 rupees a month, I have all the money I need, you can double it and pass it to someone else. For me that was astounding. He's not in the top 5%,
Yeah.
but that clearly shows you the skew of, say, people operating in metropolises who want like a 12 LPA package or a 24 LPA package and so on and so forth, and the rest of the country. Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And
Or the,
if
yeah,
you're
go
in
on.
an intercaste marriage, okay, well, let me see. Love marriages are maybe 4% of the country has a love marriage, and intercaste marriage is 3%.
Where is this from? Like, where is this data
Uh,
from?
These are both from the India Human Development Survey, which is conducted by the National Council for Applied Economic Research, and from the National Family Health Survey, which is conducted by the Government of India.
Are the people with love marriages more vocal? Because you certainly, like, if
Again,
you,
it's the
yeah.
bubble effect. It's the bubble effect. It shows you that we live in an extremely homogeneous bubble. People who are all extremely privileged, extremely rich, have liberal values, have intercaste sort of relationships, and we assume that this is new India, that this is what the country is now like.
Wait, so what about underreporting of love marriages? Is that a thing? Because you would assume more, right? Like, as time has.
You would assume more. No, I can't. I mean, I can. It's there is a sort of reporting errors on all sorts of things, but if I had to sort of put my money on what is likely to be the most misreported category, I would not say love marriages, because these are household surveys. So there's a surveyor coming to the house and asking, okay, are you married? Was it a love marriage or an arranged marriage? There isn't an enormous incentive to lie on that one.
I feel like I just have to
Sit down.
go take a Shatabdi or a Rajdhani and travel to each state and probably have temporary employment in one of these statistic institutes so that I stop seeing the country the way I see it, because it's so skewed. Okay, so yeah.
Here's my counter proposition. You don't need to go anywhere. This sort of mix of or this sort of distance from Indian reality operates wherever we live. So my life in Chennai is similarly operates in an elite bubble, and if I wanted to understand what Indian reality is better, I just need to sort of walk down the street and talk to more people. So you don't need to go anywhere, and particularly if you live in Faridabad, that's an extremely it's a mixed region in many ways. It's just that the way we live our lives, we don't encounter Indian realities.
So, Rukmini, now that you have all this data, what can people do? I mean, obviously, they will read your book, which is excellent, beyond par. But say, how can someone who's not trained in data journalism or data mining, does not understand SQL or any of these complicated, relatively simple technologies, what can they do in their daily lives to use data to probably enhance their lives? Because each of the things you've told successively to me have been revelations that I could never figure on my own. Typically, when you go about your life, I mean, I'll just quickly explain like how people develop perspectives. People read some things and they acquire a new perspective. Mostly it's your environment. You hang out with 5 or 6 people, then you meet new people when you go to a new place, and then someone tells you something that is exactly opposite to what you believed about something. And then like your walls break down and you slowly start to change. But those are one-off things. People, encounter new beliefs when they travel a lot. But largely you can say that people don't really change with their core beliefs. They largely operate as a consequence of their environment and the things that they do daily. But when data comes into play, I really think it can alter behaviors. For example, I'm totally going to look at how I spend money now. I'm totally going to reevaluate living situations and be kind to those people in my life who complain about not getting laid, because I now know that they're just like the rest of the country. So what I'm trying to ask is, what can the rest of the country or people listening to this podcast do to make data about their lives and make it better?
That's a great question. Yeah, so let me start with one thing. I don't think that people who do not have this information are where they are because of something wrong that they've done. So I don't think it is that people aren't reading what they should be reading, or are wasting their time, or are ignorant. I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is on the communication side. We've done a really poor job of creating this foundational information if it hasn't reached people. And my uh, mission is to change that. I can't get into all of it right now, but that is sort of work that uh, I'm embarking on. There's a huge gap between data that exists and people, and we need to bridge that. And people not knowing it is an indictment of us and not of them. So the work is to be done on our side, not on people's side. That's what I believe. Because when people do get this information, it's always this that I didn't know this. Where can I read more about it? How can I find out more? How can I share it with people in my WhatsApp group? It's always that sort of response, which really makes me feel that we've done people a disservice by not, getting the information that they need to them. But once you have this information, I have a couple of suggestions. One is, so here's the thing. I have no math, stats, or tech skills myself. And what I do, or the way I'm able to figure out numbers, is by reading slowly and logically and asking where I don't know with an open mind. And that's what I would want other people to do as well, which is let's not let inbuilt biases become so strong that we become completely, that we refuse to accept new information and update our beliefs where they need updation. So let's be open to that information. Let's keep eyes open for where to get that information from, and then read slowly, read logically, ask questions, and then update your beliefs if the numbers have convinced you. So yeah, there's two sides that need to work. We need to share this data better, and then when people do have this information, perhaps they could have a more open mind and not let inbuilt biases come in the way of it. And lastly, I just want to say there's a lot of bad communication out there. There's a lot of bad media. There's a lot of bad faith media. But where there's good information, then perhaps the onus is on all of us to do a better job of consuming it. Vote with our feet and choose a more credible information that's better based in the data.
Awesome. Rukmini, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you for giving facts as opposed to opinions, because I think numbers have a way of cementing your reality in something so tangible that I don't think that cleverly crafted opinions can. People can get your book, Whole Numbers and Half Truths, on Amazon. People can follow you on Twitter. What's your username so that we can plug it in?
I'm Rukmini, Rukmini on Twitter. And also I would say, please do buy my book. But if there's a independent bookstore in your city, please buy from there instead.
Yeah, you're not a fan of Amazon?
I'm not, well, I wouldn't say not a fan, but I would say that the sort of greatest part of having a book out in the world has been going to bookstores and meeting bookstore owners and the communities that they foster.
Yeah.
It's been an absolute joy. So every opportunity I can get, I want to encourage more people to do that. There are bookstores for example, there's a bookstore called bookworm in Bangalore that will ship books to you wherever you are in the country. You can send them a DM on Instagram or Twitter, and they'll send books. So they're as good as any of the big corporate delivery services. Why not support them?
Yeah, I think bookstores also allow you to like kind of get into a reading community whether you want it or not. Otherwise, you're just reading books by your lonesome. It's also cool that you have like a single name Twitter username. You must have gotten on it really early.
Not really. I mean, I suppose relatively early, but also there's a backstory there. So, but yeah, now I'm one name. As a friend in the US said, I'm like Madonna. I'm one name only.
Well, it's been awesome talking to you. So this is the end of the podcast. People can check out the show notes, yada yada yada. Don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you all next Tuesday or Friday. Bye bye. Take care.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye.